Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Yares, who is assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Michigan State University. And we will be discussing her newly published book, which is titled Jewish Sunday Schools, Teaching Religion in 19th-Century America, published by NYU Press. Yeah, not 17th Century America. It's about Sunday schools, and this is their how they began and what basically their rise and downfall, I guess it would be. But we'll be discussing, roughly, but we'll discuss more about them. So thank you, Professor Yares, for joining me.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah. So I'm an assistant professor here in the Religious Studies Department at Michigan State University in good old East Lansing, Michigan. And I'm not originally from Michigan, as you have probably surmised by hearing me talk. I'm from Birmingham, England. Birmingham is the second largest city in the UK. And I grew up there and went to university first in the UK and then later in Canada, and then did my PhD here in the US. And I've always been interested in the history of Jewish education and how things in other contexts were different from the context that I was familiar with growing up in the UK. And when I came to the US and I started learning more about Jewish education here in America, and particularly from a historical point of view, it seemed to me that there was this huge gap in the historiography, in historical writing on Jewish education during the 19th century. There was a fabulous book written by a historian by the name of Diane Ashton, Zichrono Livracha, on Rebecca Gratz, who was the founder of the first Jewish Sunday School, and I'm sure we'll talk more about her later on. And then most of the history picks up in the 20th century, right, with the arrival of Eastern European immigrants, and who, of course, created many, many different kinds of educational institutions. But there's a gap of about 70 years, right, two to three generations, of whom there'd been very, very little written. And where there had been scholarship, it had mostly been pretty dismissive, pretty derogatory. It said things like, well, there were Sunday schools, there were this wonderful intervention and invention created by Rebecca Gratz, but that then they really had nothing of value to contribute, run by women who didn't know anything. And, nothing really sort of happens in Jewish education until the turn of the 20th century. And from my own training as a historian, I can tell you that, whenever someone says something like, we don't have to take much notice of this because it was just something that was run by women, there's usually a little bit more of a story there to investigate. And that was what brought me to the book. I did my PhD in Washington, D.C., and so I was starting to do research in the Library of Congress. And one of the first things I started to find when searching for materials on 19th century American Jewish education was just there were tons and tons of catechisms. American Jews wrote catechisms, and they wrote them in droves. And of course, this is very, very surprising, right? If you think of catechisms today, if you have any association with that word, for most folks, it tends to be with Catholic education, where they're still used very, very widely. But catechisms were used very, very broadly in 19th century American Jewish education, as in 19th century American education more generally. And so as I started reading these catechisms, it struck me that there was actually quite a lot of untapped source material that I might be able to dig into.
So we'll discuss what a catechism is if listeners aren't familiar, and we'll discuss some other things. I do want to mention, you mentioned the late Professor Ashton and her book. I will say for listeners of the podcast, actually, I don't think I've said this on the podcast, I reached out to her about the book to interview her about Rebecca Gratz, she responded about a month before her passing, unfortunately, and she was interested. Yeah, it was very sad. And then I found out after that she passed. So unfortunately, I didn't get to interview her and talk about Rebecca Gratz. So this gives us the opportunity to discuss a little bit about Rebecca Gratz on the podcast, a fascinating figure, very important, influential figure, Philadelphia family, who was involved in Sunday schools. Before we start with, because Rebecca Gratz is, I guess, really where to start with. So even though you're from England, you got interested in American Jewish history.
Yes, I was very interested in American Jewish education. I think growing up in the UK, America still seems like a little bit of a sort of golden Medina, right? From in terms of Jewish resources and Jewish communal resources in particular. So I'd always been quite fascinated by American Jewish education and by the different kinds of institutions and offerings and how different it was from the UK, where I grew up. Added to that, funding to do doctoral work in the US is much more plentiful than is available in the UK. And the entire system is different. So in the US, when you come and you work on a PhD, you tend to take classes and do comprehensive exams. And it's a much more kind of well-rounded education that prepares you to be a teacher and to develop expertise in a broad set of content areas before you go on to write your dissertation. In the UK and in Europe, it tends to be the case that you enter your PhD program and your advisor says something like, well, great, see you in 3 years when you've got a completed dissertation. And I really wanted to have the opportunity to really train in a more holistic way to be a teacher in religious studies and Jewish studies. So for me, and the American system was a better fit. And being local here in the US, it just happened so naturally that I would use the sources that were locally available to me and take the questions that I was interested in and pursue them here in a US context.
Okay, so let's start off with, we mentioned already the book is about Jewish Sunday schools and what is a Sunday school, but I guess you can start off before probably even discussing Sunday school. Rebecca Gratz, a little bit about her and her background, and then why and how, what she created with these Sunday schools and started and why she did so.
Yeah. So I think that one of the things that might be most interesting for your listeners to realize right from the outset is that whilst we might have ideas that Sunday schools are a thing that is mostly the preserve of liberal Jews and liberal Judaism, Rebecca Gratz was Orthodox. She was a member of an Orthodox family, Orthodox congregation, Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. She was Sephardi. And she did not set out to create an institution that was for quote unquote liberal Jews, right? She created the first Sunday school in 1848 and the sort of hard and fast lines that we might think of as being quite characteristic of American Judaism today really didn't exist in that context. So let's set the scene. Rebecca Gratz is a wealthy Jewish woman living in Philadelphia. She has resources at her disposal, and she dedicated her life to volunteer and charity work, as a lot of wealthy women were really starting to do in the 1830s, 1840s, around the mid-19th century. This is a time in which wealthy Christian women were really plowing their efforts into volunteer work, and Jewish women followed their example. So Rebecca Gratz, she wasn't married, she didn't have children, although she played a very, very active role in raising many of her nephews and nieces, including nephews and nieces who were born to parents who had one Jewish parent and one Christian parent. She was a very, very formative influence in those children's lives. She participated in a number of different charitable endeavors. She served on committees alongside Christian women that provided resources for the poor in Philadelphia more generally, for women and children especially. And then she set her sights on the cause of Jewish education. And as I said, she'd been doing informal Jewish education within her own family at home. And so this was an institutional, sort of actualization of some things that she was doing on a more domestic basis. I think to understand the context of why Rebecca Gratz created the Sunday school along the format that she did, we have to understand a little bit about the sociology of American Jewry in the 1840s. So at the beginning of the 19th century, the vast majority of American Jews were Sephardi, or at least descended from Sephardi Jews who had immigrated to the US in various time periods in search of economic opportunities, following economic opportunities. And around the 1840s and the mid 19th century, what we're starting to see is a large migration of Jews from Western and parts of Central Europe, so predominantly Ashkenazi Jews. So as Rebecca Gratz is surveying the Jewish scene in Philadelphia, she sees that there are many, many Jewish children who are the offspring of recent immigrants who have very, very few resources to provide their children with any form of Jewish education, Jewish or any form of education, Jewish or otherwise. This is a time that preceded child labor laws. And so many of these children were spending their days going out to work, doing paid work to support their families. Or if they were going to any kind of school, they were starting to go to some of the public schools that were beginning to open up on the East Coast. And these public schools were accessible for anybody who wanted to go. They were not fee-paying institutions. But it would be wrong to think of them as sort of public in a non-sectarian sense. There was active proselytizing that was happening in these public schools. But these children, who again were children of recent immigrants, didn't necessarily have the resources to attend more intensive Jewish all-day educational institutions. So in the mid-19th century, during the 1840s, there were a couple of different opportunities for children to receive a Jewish education. The landscape wasn't nearly as extensive as it is today, but there were some different options. Of course, there were all-day Jewish institutions that were run by educators, particularly educators who had received Jewish educational training in Europe. Some of them were day school, what we'd call like day schools. Others were boarding schools. Congregations also maintained all-day schools that taught both secular subjects as well as Jewish subjects, just as the day schools did. And congregational schools tended to be a bit more affordable. There were also some, what we would describe as Talmud Torahs, right, that had more intensive afternoon offerings multiple days a week, focusing mainly on Jewish subjects. But all of these required that you had money. All of these necessitated that you didn't rely on your children to economically support your household. And particularly for the congregational schools that tended to be the more financially accessible ones, they still typically required that your family was a member of a congregation. And for a lot of these new migrants, that wasn't the case. They didn't have those kinds of economic resources. So the Sunday school was really a pragmatic intervention. Rebecca Gratz saw that many of these children, either if they were going out to work or going to the public schools, were subject to pretty aggressive evangelization. That was how she described the rationale for creating these Sunday schools. These children were being targeted by missionaries, both in their places of work, in their public schools, or even when they were out playing on the street. And so she reasoned that it would be prudent to create a safe space for them to go on Sunday mornings where they could learn very much the basics of Jewish education, and that would not only give them a place where they could avoid being co-opted into church schools by enthusiastic missionaries if they were out playing on the Philadelphia streets, but it would also give them a basic literacy, right, with the hope that would maybe kindle their enthusiasm for Jewish life, and perhaps even more critically, give them enough vocabulary to defend themselves against missionaries. So this was very much a pragmatic institution, right, that was trying to create an opportunity for children who otherwise had very little recourse to Jewish school to have at least a basic fundamental education in what it meant to be Jewish. And the way that Rebecca Gratz made it affordable for any child who wanted to attend was that she marshaled other women like her who were wealthy, who had some basic knowledge of Judaism and Jewishness, and she organized them to serve as volunteers. And of course, with very few overheads other than providing basic materials, rent for a space, with all of the teachers being being volunteers, that made it a financially accessible institution for this generation of children who were new immigrants who had very few financial resources.
A couple of things. First of all, you mentioned Rebecca Grattan. She was Orthodox. She was part of Mikveh Israel, where Isaac Leeser famously was the chazan for a while, and I think there was some sort of relationship with Isaac Leeser there in Philadelphia. You mentioned she started the Sunday schools, but there wasn't a push at this time to have kind of what would later become the Jewish school, sending children to a Jewish school instead of a public school. That only came much, much later.
Well, they did exist. There was that option, but most families simply couldn't afford them. It just wasn't a financially accessible institution, both because there was not a lot of disposable income for families who were new immigrants, and because children were really important parts of the family economy. Children went out to work during the week, or they took care of younger children so their parents could go out to work. And so sending children to any kind for some families, sending children to any kind of full day institution just was a non-starter. And paying for secular or any other kind of education was very much a non-starter as well. So they did exist, not to the same extent that they exist now, but day schools, as we would call them, did exist.
So essentially, she was trying to do a best case and a worst case scenarios kind of thing, so to speak. You're saying she was trying to give them some sort of a Jewish education at least, and like you said, get them away from the missionaries, etc. Okay, so let's talk about the Sunday schools. Like you said, it was started by a woman, so it has like were the teachers only women? Were there men involved in the school? What did they teach there? Who was in charge? Like, talk about the functioning, especially in the early days, and as we'll move along as things progress from there.
It's a lot of questions. Let's start with gender. So the reason that the Sunday school was a viable model was because people donated their time. They volunteered their time to teach, and the people who had time to volunteer were largely women. And so all of the schools that followed Rebecca Gratz's model, within a year, another school had been set up by another Orthodox congregation, Shaarei Israel in New York, very explicitly modeled on Rebecca Gratz's school. It was all women volunteer teachers. Within another short amount of time, Charleston in South Carolina founded a Sunday school, again, run by a female superintendent, staffed by female volunteer teachers. And so schools begin to be set up across the country, not only by liberal communities and liberal congregations that began to self-identify during this period as reform, but by established Orthodox communities as well. It was largely women, and their volunteer labor was what made these schools available. And that could cause some friction. With established synagogue communities, with established schools, of course, because then, as in many contexts now, Jewish education was the preserve of male rabbis and educators. And so for rabbis, for men who had come to the US with some kind of background in Jewish education and learning. And one of the things that you see quite a lot in this period are advertisements in the Jewish press, with people saying things like, I arrived in the US and here are my credentials. I've been examined on my knowledge of Jewish subjects by Rabbi so-and-so in whatever part of Europe, and I'm looking for employment. Please employ me. The Sunday school was a really, really threatening invention for these educators because it compromised their ability to make a living. It compromised enrollments for congregational all-day schools, and it compromised the livelihoods of private tutors. And for many of these educators, they don't have good things to say about the Sunday schools because they see them as very thin in terms of what they're teaching. Because after all, what can you teach in a few hours on a Sunday morning? Of course, that doesn't compare to the volume of material that you can cover in a more time-intensive setting. But even more critically, it comprised their ability to make a living. And so you see very, very negative commentary on the Sunday school movement during this period, including from people that you might expect to be supporters of the initiative. So, for example, I open the book with a quote from Isaac Mayer Wise, who, if you are familiar with that name, you might know that he's really the architect of Reform Judaism in America. He's a 19th century German American rabbi who is very, very heavily involved in founding the major institutions of Reform Jewish life: the Hebrew Union College, the Reform Seminary, rabbinical institutions, etc. And when he came to America and he saw the Sunday school, he described it as a serpent that needed to be decapitated, right? With using that analogy to represent something sort of slimy, underhand, that was squeezing the life out of more rigorous and more time-intensive Jewish institutions. However, Isaac Lisa, who you mentioned a few minutes ago, who was the Chazan of Mikveh Israel, I think had a much more pragmatic view. And whilst it was not the educational system that he would have preferred, and that he was a very, very involved educator and set up a Jewish day school in Philadelphia, was very much a supporter of intensive Jewish education. He saw that this was pragmatic. He saw that this was reaching a generation of children who would never have been involved in, never have been able to attend all-day institutions. And so from his perspective, this could only be a net good, because giving children at least some kind of foundational literacy in Jewish subjects at least had the potential that, given that introductory opportunity, that they would come to develop more rigorous understanding and more established connections to the Jewish community. So there were really, really gender dynamics that are important to understand about the 19th century Sunday school. But by the sort of 1860s, 1870s, it becomes really, really apparent that Sunday schools are really not only here to stay, but that they are the preferred educational option for most American Jews. They really align with the way that most American Jews at the time thought about institutional Judaism, right? Something that you might do a once or twice a week, but not necessarily something that you would be involved in every single day. And as that happened, as Sunday school started to be created under the auspices of congregational settings, congregational rabbis started to become more involved in the Sunday school educational curriculum. So an institution that was founded by a woman, and that spawned replica institutions that were also founded by women and taught primarily by women teachers. Within a generation, they were being led by men who were congregational rabbis, and often in a congregational context, there would be an education board that would supervise the curriculum and decide what could be taught. Women were still very actively involved. In fact, it was their volunteer labor that continued to make Sunday school education a viable financial model. But they tended to be teaching younger children, whereas the congregational rabbi would teach the confirmation class. And we can talk more about confirmation, but it became a very, very important coming of age ceremony during this period, and even in some contexts replaced bar mitzvah as the sort of coming of age ceremony of choice. So rabbis would teach the confirmation class. You asked about what would be taught. In those confirmation classes, rabbis would predominantly be teaching catechism. So what are catechisms? Catechisms are question-answer primers or primers of Jewish knowledge. So written in sort of question-answer format, what are Jewish holidays? They are this. And children were expected to memorize those questions and answers so that when asked one of those questions, they could parrot back the response. And it really does need to be emphasized that this idea that learning could be conveyed through memorization was the predominant pedagogy of the 19th century. this is just how people taught. They taught this way in public schools. This is how English was taught. This was how arithmetic was taught. And of course, in Christian education as well. So in adopting the technology of the catechism, Jews were certainly taking on a pedagogical tool that was very common within Christian education. But that technique of rote memorization had a much more kind of widespread cultural currency. Catechisms were written by Jews very, very prolifically during the modern era. The first catechisms used in American Jewish schools were authored in Europe, brought across by immigrants. Those catechisms started to be republished in America, and then eventually American Jews started writing their own catechisms for American Jewish children. The first was written by Isaac Leeser for use in Rebecca Gratz's school, and then other educators and rabbis began writing catechisms as well. So catechisms try to cover the broad swathes of Jewish knowledge in a really condensed form, in basically not much more than a pamphlet. And so catechisms that were written by authors of more traditional orientations really focused on giving an overview to all of the aspects of an observant Jewish life, Jewish holidays, sort of basics of the Siddur, kashrut, all of the things that you might give over in a sort of intro to Judaism kind of context. For more reform and liberal authors of catechisms or authors that served reform or liberal school settings, the focus tended to be more on theology, right? On saying what Jews believed and establishing how that might be different from what Christians believe. And I think this reflects the defining orientations of Reform versus traditional Judaism, certainly in this era, right? Which is for, in the context of more traditional Jewish authors and school settings, the focus of Jewish education was really about developing the literacy to live a Jewish life, both in terms of observing the Jewish calendar, participating in shul, in synagogue contexts. Whereas for the Reform or liberal communities, the orientation was really towards thinking about Judaism as a religion, common to the ways that other traditions, predominantly Christianity, was also a religion, and setting up how Judaism had all of the resources that Christianity had. It had ideas about God, ideas about creation, ideas about ethics, ideas about morals, and really showing that Judaism matched all of those things. So catechisms were very, very widely taught. There were catechisms for younger children as well that were often taught by women. And in addition to catechism, the curriculum was really obviously a very truncated one, because Sunday schools met either for a few hours on Sunday morning or maybe once or twice during the week, either on a weekday or perhaps a Saturday morning. And the curriculum focused on Bible, on the Parsha of the week, typically taught in English, because very few of the female volunteers who taught in Sunday schools had a working knowledge of Hebrew, because, of course, they didn't have access to Jewish schools themselves as children, right? They were teaching what they knew. And so they would teach Bible in a sort of devotional kind of context in English. They would teach the sort of basics of Jewish holidays, basic ritual observances, and of course, ideas about morality through a Jewish lens as well.
There's a couple things that I want to follow up on, but before that, so who was generally in charge of these schools? As you said later on, the later on ones became associated with congregations, and then it became very associated with the Reform movement. But especially earlier on, who was in charge of these Sunday schools?
Yeah. In the earliest period, they were led by female superintendents. They were led by women. And those women had to recruit volunteer teachers. They had to, find a space for the school to meet. Had to get educational materials and resources. And so these women were very, very enterprising. And I think we see that they had like a really entrepreneurial sort of energy and spirit. And of course, they had personal connections and resources of their own as wealthy women that they were able to marshal to the cause. In a number of contexts, and I talk about this in the book, we see wealthy women founding Sunday schools. And as a result of the energy that the school was able to amass, right, the enthusiasm of the children for their lessons, congregations followed. Often in many particular frontier communities, right, communities that had small Jewish communities that were growing, the Sunday school was the first thing to be established, and a congregation followed. So Sunday schools that were founded and led by women we can consider quite responsible for the establishment of Jewish communities across the American landscape.
Something that you mentioned before, I do want to follow up on, especially as it pertains to the earlier ones, when it was, as you said, it was really a woman, female institution, essentially. So you said there was a lot of criticism, and some of that came from it was affecting their jobs, or but there was gender-related criticism. But was there any validity to that criticism, though? That it was kind of a thin education, and there were issues with it.
Yeah, I think we have to admit that there was some validity to that criticism, but also to be realistic, right? So the critique was these women who have no Jewish education of their own can teach less in a few hours once or twice during the week than we trained Jewish educators can teach if children come multiple days a week or all day to our Jewish educational institutions. Well, I mean, there's no arguing with that, right? That's absolutely fair. But what these critiques were missing out on were the fact that the children that these Sunday schools were targeting were not children who had the resources to attend full-day institutions. They were children with very, very few financial means. And so it was Sunday schools were a shoestring institution, but they were really targeting children who were operating on a shoestring budget. Eventually, after hearing these critiques for a while, these women educators started to turn around and develop the confidence to say, but if we don't know anything, it's because we never had the chance to learn it ourselves. We as girls were not, growing up in the early 19th century, permitted access to congregational schools, to the private tutors that our brothers might have enjoyed. Our parents didn't teach us as much about the Siddur or Hebrew as our male counterparts had. And so for these women teachers, teaching in the Sunday schools really starts to take on an important dimension as continuing Jewish education for themselves. These women are not naive. They know that they have limited knowledge, but they also know that they had few opportunities to develop that knowledge. And so one of the things that Isaac Leeser starts to implement very early on in the Philadelphia Sunday School was that whereas the women were teaching the classes to the children, he came and gave classes to the teachers, right, as a sort of professional development. And I think that's a really, really important moment in the history of Jewish education, because it's taking women seriously as students of Jewish content and as educational providers, and giving them appropriate professional development to be able to deliver, right, their educational curriculum. And it's also a really important moment when women are starting to advocate, right, for educational equality and educational access by saying, these critiques are not valid if you are denying us the opportunities to actually receive a Jewish education of our own.
So these schools, was there tuition, or they were free for these students to attend?
They tended to have a very, very minimal tuition, very, very minimal, a few cents, maybe $1 or $2 for the year.
Okay, so therefore they were able to, like you said, families of little means were able to send their children there. So subsequently, we've already mentioned the schools started changing. They had the catechism, stuff that became associated with the congregation. Rabbis became involved, overseeing it, etc. Eventually, these schools, as you lay out in the book, and you kind of alluded to, they came to be associated with the Reform movement. But they were not founded by the Reform movement. As you said, Rebecca Gratz was Orthodox. They were founded Orthodox. But how do they come to be associated with the Reform movement. And then the Reform movement has them, they're not only Sunday, they end up going to Saturday, they're on Shabbos, or Sunday, so they end up moving. Like, how does that come to be?
Yeah. So I think that the Sunday school movement starts to follow denominational lines at the same time that American Judaism writ large starts to follow denominational lines, right? If we could sort of plop down in Jewish America in the 1840s, we wouldn't see these sort of hard and fast divisions between, denominational institutions or movements that we see today. And partly that's because of scarcity of resources, right? Like, there were very, very few contexts in which there are multiple Jewish institutions in town, obviously, beyond the sort of major centers of immigration. And so people tended to go to whatever synagogue, whatever community resources were available to them, without sort of hard and fast allegiances to denominational movements. So in part, the answer to your question is that as American Judaism starts to follow these sort of denominational borders and boundaries, the Sunday schools do as well. The second answer to that question, though, is that Sunday schools are constantly wrestling with the limitations of their curriculum and the extensions of their ambitions. So one of the critiques of Sunday schools in previous historical work on the topic, which I think is actually very unfair, has been to say that these schools taught nothing and they were sort of stagnant, taught by these untrained volunteer women. And it wasn't until the early 20th century with waves of new immigrants that the Jewish educational landscape began to be more vibrant. And having looked in depth at the primary sources from the period, I don't think that's a fair critique, because I see the educators, the rabbis, the educational boards, the national leaders, as well as the local leaders who were involved in Jewish education during this period, really wrestling with this question of how do we deliver as much content as we can, whilst wrestling with the limitations of only meeting once or twice a week, just for a few hours, with teachers who themselves had not received a particularly robust Jewish education. And so they're very, very aware of those limitations, and they're constantly tinkering, right? Constantly tinkering with the formulae, with what should be taught, with how much they can teach, with how many hours they should meet, right? They're really wrestling through these questions. I think it's important to note that many of the Jewish women who taught in Sunday schools during this period were also public school teachers. So women became public school teachers in record numbers during the mid to late 19th century, and Jewish women in particular were very much overrepresented as public school teachers. Of course, this is the time when public school education is being founded, and normal schools, which are teacher training colleges, are being set up across the country. So many of the women who teach in Sunday schools are going to normal schools, and they're receiving teacher education training, and they're teaching in public schools. And so in this project of sort of tinkering and trying to work out how much can you teach, how do you teach effectively, many of these women are bringing in the knowledge that they have from these general educational settings. So there's a lot of tinkering that is happening and sort of moving back and forth between these two poles of how much content can we teach, to what extent do we have to make this an effective and engaging experience. And by the end of the 20th century, certainly within reform or more liberal contexts, that pendulum is very much swinging towards the pole of engaging experience. So recognizing that children have very little attitude and appetite for memorizing catechisms every Saturday and Sunday. They really kind of swung towards a more kind of affective, centered educational experience. And this is really kind of bound up in broader cultural dynamics of recognizing that children are the subjects of their educational experiences, and that children have to be engaged if they're going to learn. That is coming out of research that is happening in educational scholarship at the turn of the 20th century, particularly in the context of child psychology, which is founded and established during this period. And reform educators are really sort of drinking deep from that well, right? And thinking about what it means to think about children as the subjects of their education, and how to engage them, how to teach them in ways that are appropriate to to their age, and so really kind of swinging towards that more kind of affective and experiential mode. And at the same time, of course, you have the arrival of a large number of new immigrants who are bringing educational models from their home countries, Talmud Torahs, and other kinds of settings that have a much more pronounced emphasis on content knowledge and content acquisition. So in that, within that landscape, you start to see this hardening of two distinct camps, right? Of reform schools that are really trying to sort of dig into this question of what does it mean to engage children, to develop a sense of their own spiritual identity in some ways, and then schools that are really focused on developing different forms of content knowledge, whether that is Hebrew as a spoken language in the more sort of Zionist kind of national sense, or whether that is sort of traditional religious content knowledge. In the 20th century, those poles start to merge and to move together, but that is how the sort of Sunday school gradually became from a non-denominational institution into a reform one.
It becomes more reform institution, but there are reform Judaism Sunday schools. Are there still Orthodox Sunday schools later in the 19th and early 20th century?
There are a variety of different part-time models, right, across the denominations. And, I think to give a really constructive example, of course, there are sectors within American Orthodoxy today that are still using Sundays, which is the time, of course, when most children, right, are not going to be involved in going to school as the time to develop an educational program, right, that by necessity has a curriculum that is appropriate to that amount of time. And so, of course, the example that comes to mind is Chabad, right, which has a extensive network of schools that are run on Sunday mornings, right? Of course, from a more sort of halakhically grounded orientation than you would find in the Reform or Conservative synagogue down the street, but still that model, right, of using the day of the week when that is designated as the National Day of Leisure to give children a foundational literacy in Jewish subjects.
Now let's talk about the confirmation, because that's you discuss it at length in the book, and I think that's important to discuss. So we'll discuss what they learned for the confirmation and this confirmation ceremony, which is interesting to hear about. That takes place on Shavuos. And by the way, even though this is, again, another hallmark of the Reform movement, as you discuss in the book, this occurred in Orthodox communities and shuls as well, and there was kind of back and forth, two sides in the Orthodox world, if they should allow this or not. Is it a Reform thing? Is it not? So let's start at the beginning of what were they teaching for confirmation, and then what was the confirmation ceremony and it being on Shavuos?
Yeah. So confirmation is really big business in the 19th century. It becomes Jewish theater in a lot of ways. It's the major event of the year, so much so that if you read Jewish newspapers from the time around Shavuos, around confirmation season, what you start to see are reviews, almost like theater reviews that you might read in the New York Times of a new show. Right. So these are reviews of a different confirmation ceremony that are talking about, the aesthetics and the pageantry and the rituals and the performance of the children and the music. And what you often see are descriptions of women swooning and fainting because it's so overcrowded. So this is really big business. Confirmation is the graduation ceremony from Sunday schools. It's the coming of age. It's a coming of age ritual that emerges in Germany, emerges in the context of the Reform movement, Jewish Reform movement in Germany. Of course, it's an adaptation of a Christian ceremony for coming of age. And German Jews who were involved in the Reform movement saw this as a really appealing ceremony to adapt into a Jewish context for a number of reasons. Firstly, both girls and boys could be involved in confirmation. And secondly, it showed that Jewish coming of age could look like Christian coming of age, right? Because bar mitzvah wasn't easy to translate to the outside world, right? It seemed to suggest that that Judaism met all of the critiques that contemporary Christians accused it of, that it was overly focused on legal issues, on sort of ritual minutiae, and wasn't capable of sort of the sort of grand theological ideas that Christianity could contribute to the world. And so confirmation was in many ways an attempt to show that Jewish religion could be all of those things too. In many contexts in the US, it was adapted as an addition to the bar mitzvah, right? So after your bar mitzvah, as in many contexts today, you would have a confirmation, a few years down the line, maybe a little bit older, to mark this, sort of coming of age in this very appealing ceremonial way. But in other contexts, it was taken on as the alternative to bar mitzvah. So bar mitzvah was gotten rid of, and congregations had group confirmation ceremonies as the coming of age, which all children from the religious schools would participate in. And so confirmation, as the name implies, the central ritual was about confirming, right? Confirming that you identified yourself as a member of the Jewish community, confirming that you believed the core theological tenets of Judaism. And all of these things would be taught, of course, in catechism. And so children would prepare for their confirmations by learning their catechisms in their confirmation classes, typically with congregational rabbis. And one of the high points of the event was that they would recite their learning before the congregation. Okay, so remember earlier we talked about catechisms being questions and answer, and that was really quite dull to learn for students. But in the context of confirmations, it looked very, very impressive that when a rabbi would ask a question, all of these students could tell you, right, this very kind of well thought through response to the question, even though it wasn't their own words, even though they were parroting what they were saying, even though they might not have even understood what they were saying, it looked impressive. And in the context of American Jewish community that was becoming very, very secular, very, very assimilated in many ways, it seemed to contemporary observers that this really was a vote of confidence in the Jewish future, that all of these children knew something about what it meant to be Jewish and to be a member of the Jewish community. So confirmations became popular amongst both Reformed Jews and Orthodox or more traditional Jews that maintained a bar mitzvah in addition to confirmation for the whole class of boys and girls, because it had these sort of strongly theatrical kind of dimensions to the ritual. Of course, confirmation is an invented ritual, right, in Jewish context. And so with very, very few mandates around what confirmation should look like, you could sort of do what you want with it. And Jews made it into this very sort of spectacular sort of ritual theater. And so you would read in contemporary newspaper reports accounts of children ceremonially parading to the front of the shul, often carrying elaborate bouquets of flowers that were invested in different symbolisms. Floral decoration was used very, very extensively during confirmation, and this was, of course, a nod to the calendar setting of Shavuos, right? And a celebration of life and abundance and revelation and newness. And so you had lots and lots of flowers, lots and lots of ritual, lots and lots of pageantry, music, often quite spectacular music, often particularly in more wealthy congregations, sung by paid choirs, if not a choir made up of the community's children. And these very highfalutin speeches and confirmations of catechisms that were very kind of theatrically performed. And I think because this sort of met the aesthetic standards of the day of what entertainment looked like, right? What a entertaining and impressive ritual would look like. Confirmations became very, very popular, and they were adopted by traditional communities as well as Reform ones.
And you do point out in the book that there was pushback though from some Orthodox communities saying this is a reform ritual. We can't do this. We have a bar mitzvah. We don't have a confirmation ritual. It's invented, etc. But there were others that pushed back and said, okay, it's just an extra ritual. There's nothing inherently reform about it. There's nothing wrong with it. So, you talk about that kind of some yes, some no. And you do discuss a lot more. It's a very interesting, you talk about the extravagance and the opulence and some of what you said there. It was a very interesting thing that happened. So another thing also is that the rise of like literature, but you talk about a bit about magazines and literature that becomes targeting Sunday schools or like associated with the Sunday school movement as well.
Yeah. So as the Sunday school movement develops, of course, you need resources to extend to the children. In Rebecca Gratz's first school, of course, when she founded this new institution, there were very, very few resources to use, right, with these kids. These kids couldn't sit down and read a Chumash in Hebrew, right? Like that was just kind of beyond what the teachers themselves knew, beyond what the children knew. And so you needed resources in English, and there were very, very few available. So the first textbook that Rebecca Gratz used in her Sunday school was actually a Christian catechism that teachers had to go in and sort of paste over references to Jesus. And so some of the first resources that we created for Jewish Sunday schools in America were heavily edited versions of Christian materials. As time went on, Jews, of course, created their own materials, more relevant materials for use by Jewish children, but they still continued to follow the lead of Christian religious education, which is, of course, was more established, was more extensive, and had more kind of resources that could be used by Christian children. And Jewish educators, understandably, as continues to be the dynamic today, wanted Jewish children to feel that they were not missing out by not going to the Christian Sunday schools that their public school classmates did or their neighbors did, and to offer Jewish resources that were comparable, right, in terms of their interest and their aesthetic appeal. So one of the first sort of resources that starts to be created to support Jewish education is actually prizes. Christian Sunday school children would get prizes for doing things like reciting the creed or having a Bible knowledge quiz, and prizes were a big part of the Christian Sunday school model. That these Jewish children would start to feel jealous and aggrieved that they didn't have the same that they couldn't have those same appealing knickknacks. And so one of the first things that the Sunday school teachers who worked with Rebecca Gratz started to create was prizes, were things like Maimonides' Creed written out on silk, or the Ten Commandments written out on a little piece of paper, a note card. And so prizes are one of the first material products that start to get created for Jewish education. As time goes on, Jews start to more extensively model Jewish educational resources on Christian available options. So Jewish magazines become really, really, really popular. And of course, this is a time before radio. This is before television. This is before movies. So reading is a really big deal, and serialized stories in magazines. Magazine culture is really, really popular in the sort of mid to late 19th century, and so that is the sort of entertainment technology par excellence. So Jews started to create Jewish children's magazines, right? And magazines were very, very helpful because they could both be used by teachers in schools, but also could be read by children at home. And so there was a real sense among the creators of these magazines that they could sort of transcend the boundaries between school and home. And so they had names like the Jewish Home or the Sabbath Visitor, right? The Sabbath Visitor was a really big one, with the idea that the visitor, who was a character in the magazine, both visited children at home and also visited them in their Sabbath schools, in their Sunday schools. So really trying to kind of break down those, the idea that Judaism isn't just something that you engage with during your Jewish educational time on the weekend, but something you should do in all aspects of your life. And these magazines were created locally by individual rabbis and educators, and they also started to be created by the emerging national movements of American Judaism as well, what we would think of today as denominational movements. The other Carry on.
No, finish.
No, that's it. I'll stop there.
Okay. I mean, really, what I was going to get to really was the next part is that, and what brings about the downfall, the end, kind of, I don't know if downfall is the right word, whatever, kind of the downturn of the Sunday schools as we get into the beginning of the 20th century.
It's I think it's more complicated to say that than to say that they had a downfall and were never to be seen again, because in many ways I think the contemporary Jewish landscape looks a lot more like 19th century Sunday schools than what was created in the first decades of the 20th century. So, of course, we've talked about the fact that perhaps the most kind of seismic change in American Jewish history is the change that is wrought by a generation of immigrants who arrived in the US between 1881 and 1924, and coming from Russia, from parts of Eastern Europe, and they recreate educational institutions that they had had in their home communities, and that is not exclusively Orthodox religious institutions, although it certainly includes that. It's also sort of Yiddish national things like the what is now the Workers' Circle, the Worksman Circle, right? So Yiddish socialist schools, Hebraist nationalist schools, a whole kind of landscape of options for teaching various ideological frameworks of Jewish education. And I think one of the things that really united them was this idea of content knowledge, right? That in order to become, Jewish in this particular way, whether that particular way was about Yiddish socialism or sort of Hebrew nationalism or, of course, halachic orthodoxy, there was things that you needed to know, right? So much more of a sort of emphasis on Jewish content knowledge at a time when certainly Reform Sunday schools were really leaning into this idea of the sort of affective dimension and how do you affect how somebody feels, right? So really establishing a sort of chasm between the two. One of the most important figures in the history of Jewish education, certainly in the early 19th century, is a man by the name of Samson Ben-Deli. And he is brought in from Baltimore. He was born in Mandate, Palestine, and found his way to Baltimore, where he created a sort of revolution in supplementary Jewish education by really emphasizing teaching Hebrew and teaching in Hebrew, so Ivrit be'Ivrit. And Samson Ben-Deli's approach to Jewish education is what we would call something approximating national consciousness, right? He thought of Jewish education really in terms of this strong sense of peoplehood, and thought of Jewish education as the training that was necessary to equip Jewish children with all of the resources that they would need to become fully fledged members of that peoplehood, especially Hebrew. So Samson Ben-Deli was brought in to head a major institution in New York, the New York Bureau of Jewish Education. And what that bureau tried to do, supported by many, many wealthy philanthropists, was really kind of clean up the mess of Jewish educational institutions that had been created by Jewish immigrants in New York City, with the ultimate hope of creating that same change in America writ large. So, of course, there was a broad landscape of Jewish educational institutions created by these immigrants, and some were better than others. Some were, quite frankly, unsanitary. Some were using corporal punishment. Right, there were lots of reasons why many of these institutions were not necessarily desirable. And so Samson Ben-Deli creates and his many people who worked with him, men as well as women, created a platform for Jewish education in which they really tried to bring these institutions, these sort of Talmud Torahs, Chaydas, on board by saying that they too valued the importance of acquiring Jewish content knowledge. And so that is the landscape in the early part of the 20th century, right? Ben-Deli's vision were for these community-oriented Talmud Torahs that taught intensive Hebrew and, certainly had aspects of a religious curriculum as well to appease his more traditional interlocutors, the people he wanted to bring on board. And Ben-Deli thought that the Sunday schools had just nothing good. He called them Shanda schools, right? Disgrace schools. He really thought that there was very little that was valuable in them. But a couple decades after Ben-Deli's death, something happens that he could never have anticipated. And it's something that changes the landscape of American Jewry really dramatically and continues to shape it today. And that's suburbanization. Jews move to the suburbs. They move out of these sort of densely Jewish areas of downtown, and particularly in cities like New York and Baltimore and Chicago and other kinds of contexts. And in the suburban model, one shows one's primary Jewish affiliations by being a member of a synagogue, right? Maintaining a sort of densely cultural Jewish identity. It looks different, right, in the context of post-war suburbia than it does in these more densely immigrant ethnic neighborhoods that you'd experience downtown. And in the logic of congregational suburbia, where do you go to get your Jewish education? Well, you don't go to the community Talmud Torah. You go to the synagogue, right? That's the provider of Jewish education, right? Outside of the context of day schools and yeshivas, right? For still the vast majority of American Jews today, if they're going to get a Jewish education, they're going to a synagogue, right? They're going to their religious institution. And so the model for Jewish education that ultimately triumphs, right, in the late 20th century and survives until today, I think still has a lot in common with the Sunday school, which is that it follows the logic that Jewish education is religious education. It's the place where you go to develop a sense of your religious identity, right? The thing that as a Jew makes you different from a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu or what else it might be, as opposed to developing an identity that is secular or ethnic or cultural, which was really Benderly's vision, right? So it's still like the Sunday schools, this model of Jewish education that happens part-time, once, twice, three times a week, with the ultimate ends being a member of a religious community.
Right. Obviously, you're not referring to the full-time Jewish day schools or Jewish schools or religious institutions. So something that you just, as a whole on the book, you mentioned in the book that there's a lack of sources about the Sunday school. So why is that the case? And if that's the case, what sources did you use?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. So archives are political things. They're political things and they're gendered things. In short, people keep records of things that they think are valuable. And things that they think are valuable, they don't think are valuable, they don't tend to keep records of. And the thing is that what we think is valuable is, of course, a contested category. So there were very, very few available resources that talked about what it would have been like to be in one of these classrooms. And that's precisely because people didn't tend to record the voices of the teachers or the voices of the students. One of the best resources that we have are diaries of children's diaries. But like in the case of diaries today, school is only one of the many things that children are interested in. They tend to find, more interesting or at least more decisive or shaping of who they are, the things that they feel passionately about, their sports, their hobbies, their relationships, their friendships, their romantic attachments, right? People don't tend to take to their diaries to record down the minutiae of what they're doing in a classroom. I think this is still true today. If we were to try to write a book similar to the one that I wrote on 19th century Jewish education, based on supplemental Hebrew or Sunday schools today, I don't think we'd find much data ready to go, right? Because what do we know about who teaches in religious schools and what happens in the classrooms? That is something that historians and sociologists haven't really shown much interest in recording information about. So I had to cast my net very, very wide to find available resources. And so I looked in a number of different places. The Jewish press was a really, really important source for the book because it's a place where people wrote about local Sunday schools. It's also a place where people debated Jewish education, and so the Jewish press was really, really important. And again, you have to remember that the Jewish press is really the sort of communication vehicle of the day. There's no internet, there's no emails, there's no cell phones, right? So the Jewish press is how people correspond, by writing letters and opinion pieces. So the Jewish press was really important. Archival collections related to local Sunday schools were also very important, as well as archival collections related to national movements that dealt with Jewish education as well. So those are some of the sources: diaries, the Jewish press, and archival sources related to local and national congregations.
And now to clarify, by the Jewish press, you don't mean the paper, the Jewish press. You mean the Jewish press, all papers and publications and newspapers and periodicals, everything under the umbrella of, you're calling it the Jewish press, right? I just want to clarify.
Exactly. Yes. Newspapers, journals, magazines, that kind of thing. Yes.
Just as a final question, how would you view Sunday schools looking back? Rebecca Grass starts this, in the early 19th century. Now you're looking back after you wrote this book and you're looking back at them. How would you view them?
I think we're at a really interesting moment in American Judaism. Because I think if we know one thing from the sociological research on American Jewry today, we know that American Judaism is diversifying in really unprecedented ways. It's diversifying racially, culturally, economically, in terms of Jews of religion versus Jews of no religion. And so thinking about the populations, right, who are going to be served by various Jewish educational initiatives, I think that in a way we're in a sort of similar moment to the one faced by Rebecca Grass, right, who's surveying the landscape of Jewish Philadelphia in the 1840s, realized that there were many, many Jewish children who were not in any way connected to a Jewish institution, who didn't necessarily have a lot of financial resources. I think we're in a similar moment today. Many, many Jews not connected to any kind of Jewish synagogue or religious institution, right? That people are trying to reach through other means, whether it's, PJ Library or One Table or Hillel or Moshe House or any of the other initiatives, right, that have been created over the past several decades to reach the quote unquote unengaged. That was Rebecca Gratz's mission too. Right, she wanted to reach the unengaged Jewish children and to do it in a way that was actually realistic in terms of people's financial limitations. I think as we survey the American Judaism of tomorrow, there is going to be much more economic diversity, much more particularly racial and cultural diversity. And so going back and thinking about models that try to be innovative, that try to meet the needs and the limitations of their particular day and age, I think give us the potential for food for thought, right? As we think about what it will mean to provide Jewish educational opportunities in the future. Although I will say, I think that Jewish education, Jewish religious education, Sunday schools and Hebrew schools, if you map the history of particularly financial support to Jewish supplemental education over the past several decades, you'll see that it's a line that goes sort of directly down, right? Whereas funding and community support for other kinds of institutions that are perceived as being more engaging, more attractive, more experiential, more impactful, more immersive, right? Funding for those kinds of opportunities has only increased. So thinking about obviously Jewish camps, thinking about immersive tourism trips like Birthright Israel, right? Those are the kinds of institutions that are attractive to philanthropists and community benefactors to support because they seem to be most immersive and giving the most bang for the buck. So I think if people look at the landscape of Jewish supplemental education today and find it lacking, it's important to note that the proof of the pudding is sort of in the eating, and this is a part of the Jewish landscape that has been pretty systematically starved of resources, financial resources and communal resources over the past several decades. And so if they are lacking, then there is certainly a historical trajectory of why that might be the case.
Okay, so I will link to the book, Jewish Sunday Schools, in the show's notes. If anyone interested can purchase it. And thank you, Professor Yares, for joining me.
Thank you so much for the invitation.